Hi, everybody. Welcome to NCIS Reports from Phil. It's Lee Clements with a special show today. Don't have a guest to talk to, but I'm going to be reading from the historical records of the agency. And by that I mean I'm reading from what we called the NCIS Bulletin or the NIS Bulletin back in the day. This bulletin that I'll be reading from today was printed back in 1988. And great story by some of the guys I worked for when I first came in 1989, but the ONI guys that came in the 60s and the 50s, this would kind of pertain to them and kind of the way it was for them back in the day, because today's NCIS agent doesn't really have to worry about too much regarding stuff they need to do their job. But in those days, we were working on typewriters, we're working on cars that are former Navy vehicles that are literally falling apart. And that's probably some of the most comical stories that I've personally listened to and read over the years. Especially one story I recall from a supervisor who came in actually in the 80s, was still driving a car, an AMC Pacer, if you will, running leads in Montana. He said it was actually snowing inside the car. There were holes in the car, but it was snowing inside the car. That's what we had to deal with back in the day. When I first came in, I had one of my first cars was a Plymouth Grand Fury, which I thought was a cool car because it looked like a police car. All the other cars we had Buicks and we had Chevrolets, but I had a Plymouth Grand Fury, probably a 1980 Plymouth Grand Fury, but it ran like a scalded dog and had vinyl seats. And when you went down the highway, if you took a turn too fast, you would slide across the seat. And it didn't have bucket seats. Anyway, but it was even worse back in the day for the guys who came in under the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Naval Investigator Section 60. So this is a lighthearted look back on what it was like to be an agent starting in the 60s. And the name of the article is ONI in the early 60s was not what Kirschenbach expected. We're going back to the time when men still wore fedoras, looking like old-time detectives with suits. And I personally know of agents who came in during that time who didn't typically wear their fedora every day, but if they went to D.C., probably would wear their fedora. Hired in the early 60s. So the article is by Mr. Alan J. Kirschenbach. And I'll have to go into the see if Alan is still with us. But Mr. Alan J. Kirschenbach retired in 1984 following a distinguished career as an NIS special agent, which included a tour in Vietnam. He was the regional director for operations in Europe at the time of his retirement. This is back in the days when we had regional directors and we still had Navy captains, particularly in each region. So he was working in the European region, which was probably either out of London or Naples, Italy. I think it was London at the time. So anyway, Mr. Kirschenbach has a pretty comical story. This goes on for a while, but I think it's well worth listening to. As a kid growing up in Kansas, snow sledding was one of my most eagerly anticipated and fully exploited activities of my young life, even if there were only 2 sleddable hills in the entire town. I truly did love snow sledding, but I always found it hard to reconcile the long, tough slog back uphill with the quick ride down, however free, easy and exhilarating that ride might be. I find myself experiencing something similar, roughly similar, as I glide into my 4th year of retirement, with time now flying by like a crisp winter air that whistled by my ears on that downhill run of nearly 50 years ago. Similarly, but wistfully different. Similarly, yes, but wistfully different in that I need no longer to make that long climb back. The pleasant glide continues with each day, that flawless past taking me further away from my days as an NIS special agent. The NIS that was the central part of my life for so long, I see now receding away toward the distant horizon. It was with a real sense of enjoyment then that I received copies of the NIS Fall Bulletin and the slick PR brochure, This is the NIS, provided courtesy of our headquarters. Like a bald patch in the snow, It stopped the glide, and I welcomed the temporary halt, immediately taking both documents to the nearby figurative snowbank, aka Barcalounger, where I parked my ample rear end and read both cover to cover. During the nostalgic reflections that ensued, I slowly, rather sadly, realized that although a few of my contemporaries and goodly number of my near contemporaries remained among the active agent corps, there were many, many more faces whose names I do not know. Faces I will never see and whose experiences I will never share. In addition to inducing a certain pensiveness, this thought made me feel vaguely uncomfortable. At first, I found myself feeling defensive, making mental comparisons between the agent corps of which I was a part of and the young, highly trained professional agent corps portrayed in the slick brochure, which came through even after the PR hype had been discounted. And while I was forced to concede quantum advances in breadth and probable depth of training, experience, and overall professionalism, new corps over old, I easily satisfied myself that agents of my day were just as eager, just as enthusiastic, and lacked none of the dedication, competitive spirits, and professional outlook exhibited by the present-day corps. But the uneasiness I felt went beyond nostalgic reflections, and during the musings of the next several days, with my sled still parked in that long-ago Kansas snowbank, I realized my discontent was little more than my reluctance to accept the reality that I was no longer a part of the NIS Agent Corps, a reality that comes later than sooner to most retirees, I would imagine. To be ashamedly truthful, I felt like a member of a winning relay team who watches from the sidelines as the trophy, medals, and attention are given to one team member who ran the last leg of the race. Ashamedly, because I hesitate to admit that during my active NIS days, the need for recognition had been a significant motivating factor. I suppose it was, but even so, I loved being a special agent because I truly believed in what we were doing. I know that I accepted any assignment as a personal challenge, and I sought out opportunities to test myself. And God knows that I was amply rewarded in every sense of the word. Suffice it to say that I loved my job, and I respected and continually marveled at the dedication and talent of those around me. Nearly all of my memories evoke positive, pleasurable feelings, and I recall some good times, very good times indeed, remembering as well the difficult times and underfunded years and the real sacrifices made by so many. But those sacrifices were not made with an eye on any presumed ultimate benefit for those who to follow. Any sacrifice were made voluntarily, if grudgingly, to accommodate the times. Why then did I still feel vaguely discomfited? Certainly I did not believe a debt was owed by the new to the old. The very nature of a dynamic organization dictates that it be oriented toward the future, not to the past. Very simply, I was unhappy because I wanted very much to tell the new agents about the old days, about the tough uphill slog. So with great facility, I rationalized that the new had a vital need to know about their past. Such knowledge, I cleverly reasoned, not only would create a more clearly defined sense of place within the organization, but drawing on Abraham Lincoln, I aphoristically disclaimed that one cannot know where he is or where he is going unless he knows where he has been. But to where can one turn for information on past history of the Naval Investigative Service? Where are chronicles of the past reposited? There are no battle streamers affixed to the director's flag to give evidence of successful campaigns and extraordinary deeds of daring done. There is no NIS Hall of Fame or Time Record Book. No, the past history of NIS is written in the lives of individual agents, and with every retirement, a large chunk of that history floats away eventually to disappear like the iceberg that falls from the glacier face and drifts out to sea. But this need not nor should not happen. Many retirees would welcome the opportunity to share his or her recollections of a time past, and those memories should be preserved. All of them, those that brighten as well as those that blot the organizational excrucian. Such recorded memories would be of great inherent value and would provide the old with a needed opportunity to brag and recount and embellish and confess. Further, I believe that such recollections will provide convincing testimony that many ideas, techniques, and experiences now considered by the new to be unique or even revolutionary are neither so new nor original as they might think. Incidentally, I will provide the new with an opportunity to see the old as something more than unknown. Short-haired men with an old photograph supported by skinny ties, wide lapels, and cuffs on their pants. It is in this spirit, then, that I offer some of my personal recollections dedicated to all those bright and shiny modern-day NIS, now would be NCIS, warriors who so easily traverse that part of the path of progress hacked out so laboriously by all those who had gone before. I offer a glimpse of another agent corps, one whose level of expertise and professional sophistication was one generation removed, but one that loved the thrill of the chase, not one whit less. I joined the NIS, then the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, in July of 1962, 4 months after the birth of my fourth and last child. I was 32 years old and had spent the previous 8 years as a Honolulu police officer, all the while attending the University of Hawaii, where I clawed and scrabbled my way to a BA degree. The profession of law enforcement had held little appeal for me. I joined HPD in 1954 shortly after my discharge from the Army because the job was available, and with a wife and one kid, I did not have the luxury of lounging about until I found a proper calling, whatever that might have been. TV evangelist, perhaps? Who knows? While I did not really like much of the routine of lower-level police work, I did enjoy my 3 years as a detective, hence my gravitation towards an eventual acceptance by NIS in 1962. Needless to say, I reported aboard, and I was not your average wide-eyed Ivy League preppy, nor was I yet a wizened, hard-edged, butt-kicking ex-cop. Not that my police years had been a waste of time. It had been a rather valuable watershed period. My personal, political, and social philosophy had been transformed from liberal to conservative. I learned how to keep fear at arm's length, and I had developed a serviceable reservoir of cynicism, the healthy Walden sort, that of the idealist turned inside out. And fortunately, 8 years of police work had nothing to dampen my sense of humor. During my NIS pre-employment interview, I was rather intrigued to be informed that I would be required to tell neighbors and friends only that I was a research analyst, and no further mention of the Office of Naval Intelligence. I was further convinced of the high purpose of my new calling when, on a stroll through the office during that first visit, I chanced a glance at a 4-drawer file, then clearly saw that one drawer was labeled Berlin. No doubt about it, this was the big time. It was only after I was securely aboard that I discovered that my research analyst duties consisted primarily of dodging neighborhood dogs in pursuit of a developed informants to complete my required monthly quota of 20 completed background investigations, and that the drawer labeled Berlin belonged to Special Agent Edward Berlin, whose cubbyhole office was one door down the hall from my own. I was nevertheless delighted with my new job, pleasant, interesting people to work with, and I knew that I would quickly advance to criminal investigations, the better to take advantage of my experience, and more importantly, to get away from doing BIs, that's background investigations, which I considered boring and totally without challenge. Consequently, in order to impress, I produced BIs like crazy. This in the face of an occasional whispered reminders of several of my fellow research analysts that in terms of BI leads completed, this month's record would be the considered next month's quota. I benignly ignored this advice, since I was fairly new that it was not me they were worried about. But it was not all work and no play. I had ample time to stop and smell the flowers, and I did so, lying on my back among them from time to time, and I never failed to see the humor in most situations, no matter how deeply I buried. I suppose I looked for it occasionally when it wasn't really there, but that was not to say that I was not in deeply earnest, but that was not to say that I was not deadly earnest about my job. I wanted to be the very best, and I truly strived just for that. But I've always believed that no one need not be solemn to be serious. And while the philosophy has caused me some difficulty along the way, especially from the formidable, rare, high-risen, humorless types, it did not prevent me from being the first of my basic class group to be promoted to GS grades 12 through 15. Shortly after my discovery that Berlin was a co-worker and not an area of intimate assignment, I was assigned my first set of credentials, which were little more than a small card signed by the local district intelligence officer, the DIO. The card identified me as an agent, the special agent status presumably to be later conferred if all went well. The ID card was somewhat smaller than the aperture in a temporary credential case, so it was always slightly askew when displayed. But it wasn't as worrisome to me as the case itself. It was fashioned from a very soft leather, which made it wrinkled and floppy, roughly similar to an old boot tongue. Mine curled up in my pocket, requiring that it be unrolled like a small scroll every time it was displayed. I would show it either so briefly that with one hand pulling it up and the other one holding it down, then cram it back in my coat pocket where it would snap back into its little wrinkled tube. Some years later, during the late 60s, I was talking with Doc Goodbuddy Reed, temporary credentials, who was one of the high-ups in the NISRO Norfolk, Naval Investigative Service Regional Office, Norfolk. Doc laughed and told me how his first creds he came aboard were sometimes in the late 40s, as I recall. He said he was given an assignment his first day by the local DIO to report to a ship to investigate an incident. Having nothing that identified him as a Navy employee, let alone an ONI agent, he so informed the DIO. The DIO hesitated, Doc said, then ripped a letterhead off of a sheet of office stationery and handed it to him and said, "Use this." I learned several useful lessons from Doc Reed. One important was the effectiveness of a good-natured approach in all personal relationships. Another was to never attempt to swap old-time stories with any agent whose date of board precedes your own, even if only by one day. Not too long after I had been issued my boot-tongue encased agent ID card, I was assigned an automobile. Not only would I hold the keys and get to use it every day, it was mine to drive back and forth to work. Now, this didn't happen during the time when I came on in 89. We had assigned pool cars, but that was usually because it was a bigger office. But you only took a government car home on duty days. Now, agents take them home because of their assignment to high-risk operations or to the major case response team. So all of them have cars assigned to them. But in these days, there wasn't a lot of money. So anyway, not too long I'd been issued my boot-tongue agent card. I was assigned an automobile. Not only would I hold the keys and use it every day, it was mine to drive back and forth to work. I was responsible for washing it now and then and cleaning out the surveillance litter occasionally, i.e. Hostess Twinkie wrappers, chocolate Milton cartons, etc., and ensuring that it was always topped off with good 68-octane Navy gasoline. My fellow agents also advised me to be ready with an imaginative explanation should beach sand, grocery receipts, Christmas tree needles, and such like be discovered in the trunk. Now, here's another thing. When I came on board, use of a G car for unauthorized purposes was a big deal. And if you got caught going to the grocery store or carrying your kids to school or anything like that, you would get a 30-day suspension without pay. So it was a big deal. The office fleet consisted of two 1957 Chevrolets with a covey of Nash Ramblers. For those too young to have ever seen a Nash automobile, suffice it to say they were typical American Motors product, sort of an early day Yugo. And today you would probably call that an early day. But anything made in the Eastern Bloc Soviet countries back in the day, a Yugo is from Yugoslavia, and it wasn't a very good car. It looked pretty cool at first, but it wasn't a very good car. All the Ramblers were painted flat black, and except for the door handles, were chromeless. The interiors were your basic stark, enlivened, just a touch of PX fiber seat covers front and back. All had standard transmissions that malfunctioned or could never be properly repaired. The steering column mounted shift lever, which had a maximum range much like your average Montgomery Ward riding mower, which was delicate and finicky and eccentric. Some of the Ramblers had no low gear, others had no second or third, and at least one had no neutral. This was bothersome, of course, but no big deal when scouting up BI leads. Another matter, however, went in hot pursuit of a 6J, which was a case category back in the day. Repeated bucking, second gear startups, and slow-moving traffic by a flat black Rambler as supporting a 5-foot non-telescoping antenna attracted no small amount of disdainful attention. Now I was admittedly new at the game, but I had difficulty in suppressing the occasional random thought that this was not really the mark of a crack clandestine outfit. At any rate, I liked the idea of having a second car, so to speak, and I was fully prepared to accept one of those Nash beauties. Imagine the surprise then when I was handed the keys to one of the 257 Chevys. Having come aboard with some criminal investigative background, I quickly surmised that my experience was subtly recognized in the assignment of cars, and I accepted those keys with quite an humble satisfaction, betraying but the barest flicker of a prideful smile. How pride can blind. I need not tell you who are familiar with the ways of NIS that my newly assigned 1957 Chevrolet was an absolute piece of garbage. Automatic transmission, yes. Piece of garbage, nevertheless. The front and rear springs on the driver's side were totally sprung and the car permanently listed to port at a rather sharp angle. This same affliction had been visited on the front seat, where an unaccountable seat spring and the driver's position were totally compressed and completely missing for all I knew. The seat sagged to an extent that when in position behind the wheel, the average driver stared directly into the speedometer when facing front and peered just over the top of the door, still when looking left. I drove a car like that for nearly a full year, being told whenever repairs were requested that it was near survey, too costly, soon to be replaced, etc. Handling was tricky on the high-speed turns. 35 miles an hour or so, rock solid when turning left, absolutely scary when turning right. As can be imagined, I spent many hours pondering on how my car, or any car for that matter, could wind up in such shape. It was as if the car had suffered the automobile equivalent of a stroke. Had it been driven by some gigantic pituitary goon before NIS required it? Did it fall off a pier? Was it ultimately a recall or unrecalled? I never found out, but I drove it and made believe that I was sort of preferred to deep bucket seats, the list mode of motoring, and bragged about my automatic transmission whenever a black Rambler brigade made humorous references to the car or resorted to callow humor in my expense, such as rushing into my office to report that my Chevy had fallen off its side into the parking lot and some other similar crudity. As I recall, all the Ramblers and Chevys had radios with transceivers clearly concealed in the glove compartment. There were no commercial AM/FM type radios in the cars, however, so that anyone looking in, seeing no radio, naturally assumed that the 5-foot rigid antenna mounted on the starboard side was not an antenna at all, but a lightning rod possibly, or a ceiling feeler or some such. As a matter of fact, they did inadvertently serve this latter purpose on occasion. Driving through a low-roofed, multi-level concrete garage could be an interesting experience, with the 5-foot steel whip slapping each girder along the way. Made those stripped-down tiny Ramblers ring like a bell. Just the thing for making a 2 a.m. check to see if the subject's car was still at the third-level stall. There were times when I wanted to remove the antenna and leave it off all the way. But because of the unreliability of the radios in general, I don't recall whether or where we had our relay to the city, but our signals registered pretty consistently with 1x1 range. On more than one occasion, I can recall an agent resorting to just plain old yelling for short distance communication. Successful radio transmissions were many times dependent upon one's ability to understand a message transmitted entirely in a microphone on off button clicks. At least we were attempting to be professional. In addition to our mobile radio equipment, the office had a number of pieces of portable radio gear, portable that is dependent upon the size and strength and endurance of a user. One such item was the lunchbox transceiver. True, it was about the size of a lunchbox, but it weighed a ton. With a little practice, average man could carry it suitcase fashion rather unobtrusively, although the unusual state of the cords and veins on one's neck gave the hint something rather than lunch was in the box. There was a smaller unit we sometimes used when someone was being wired for a meet or some sort, usually dope related. This small unit was affixed to the small of the back by engineers' tape or duct tape with the mic button wired down to the sleeve. Again, click-click communication was employed. We did use it successfully many times, especially in the late 60s while at Camp Lejeune. Much more. Its use required a very gutsy agent with very loose clothes who could walk away from all the while keeping his back from view. Should anyone touch the back of an agent so rigged, or get even a close look for that matter, the wearer had little choice but to rapidly backpedal, unless, of course, he was unable to convince the desperadoes, unless it was his regular habit to carry an extra carton of cigarettes in that fashion. Special Agent John Cusack was an early practitioner of the humpback technique, and one of the very best. Not that he was always an eager volunteer, but he was demonically successful and came through those perilous times without visible injury. I often think that of Little John and marvel. He had mastered the art so definitively that even today he could probably mingle in a crowd, managing all the while to keep the small of his back out of all sight lines. Who was that backless man? The simple but honest townfolk murmured in mystified admiration. Many of the early special agents like John Cusack acquired a wide variety of operational skills through sheer necessity, not through NIS formal training, because such training did not exist. It was a case of policy following practice. If it worked and was approved of, such technique eventually would be adopted, formalized, and then taught at Agents Basic School or in in-office training sessions. If some new operational practice did not work or was not approved of, it was quietly abandoned, hopefully before too many knew about it and or censure resulted. When I came aboard in July of 1962, NIS had only one manual, and to characterize it as an insufficient is charitable in the extreme. It is not my intention to sound mean-spirited in this criticism. Many of those agents who were veterans when I came aboard had invested much goodwill and intelligent hard work in an effort to create an effective, cohesive entity, amorphous mass that was ONI after World War II. But much of their effort was necessarily geared toward organizational requirements, with most total emphasis on background investigations and related internal security concerns. Consequently, most office manuals and instructions were heavily on the administrative procedures and light on the operational technique, especially those relating to criminal investigations or sophisticated procedures in general. So if you needed help on ideas on possible approaches to consider a pursuit on a complicated investigation, the NIS manual was not the best source to turn to for answers. Many criminal categories in the manual were discussed only in terms of what selections of the law are violated by transgressors. An illustrative example of the inadequacy of the paucity of information on the handling of evidence. Many offices did not have an evidence locker or storage area. Seized evidence was routinely held in the agent's file drawer. Evidence forms and handling procedures were developed as dictated by need of various field offices, independent most times of the NIS regional office, let alone the NIS headquarters centralized control. These were the days of trial and error, and some of the lessons learned were painful, but necessary, since many of those early lessons are now standard practice, if not formal policy. I attended Agents Basic School in January of 1964, 17 months after my initial hire. Rather an extended period of OJT, but this was not uncommon in those days of little money and reduced hiring, and I looked forward to the school with an anticipation that was fueled not only by the wait of nearly a year and a half, but the fact that I had not left Hawaii for 17 years and never had been east of the Mississippi. My problem presented by my total lack of winter clothing was solved borrowing a number of mothballed items from several more traveled fellow agents. As a consequence of my wardrobe could be best described as very early eclectic. This was not the paramount concern to me, however, and the fact that my overcoat was a size or two big and resembled more of a greatcoat of a Civil War soldier made me no less appreciative when during my first week in Alexandria the area was covered in nearly a foot of snow, reportedly the biggest snowfall in over 10 years. Much of the basic school concerned itself with background investigations and related topics. Criminal investigation was taught, but it took a definite backseat. In fact, it was denigrated by a number of instructors. I remember all too clearly that repeated phrase that BIs were our bread and butter. Anyone can investigate a criminal case, it was said, but it took a real pro to conduct a solid background investigation. Not all the basic students believed this. If any did, reasoning that if it were true, why were all the newly hired men assigned to the BI squad before graduating and depending on some demonstrated talent to the criminal and security type investigations? I believed then, as I do now, that truly accomplished criminal investigator can do it all. This point is still in dispute, of course. The good Code 23 criminal investigators man versus the good Code 22 counterintelligence man. At the basic school and later as well, I got the feeling that many NIS agents who came with police backgrounds were looked upon as crude, unlettered, door-kicking types who held little promise. Special Agent Wojciechowicz, you remember on the TV show Barney Miller, if you will. I personally resented this. Of course, although I was ready to admit that not all former police officers did make good NIS agents, nor did all the former school teachers or accountants or speaker of Chinese. But throughout my career, I've met a number of purely intelligence types who were hollow dilettantes, lacking genuine insight into human behavior, and seemingly successful in their calling. I have met very few, if any, former successful detectives I could so describe. But it is just possible that the prejudice has different roots. It might be uncomfortable for some to be in the presence of police detective types, since their bull hockey sensors are calibrated by nanosniffs as if it were. But enough of this defensive self-justification, and back to the winter of 1964. NCIS HQ was then housed in an odd-looking green or blue building in Alexandria, which was about a block from the Lamplighter restaurant and within walking distance of the Clarendon Motel at which most basic students stayed. An apartment at the Clarendon was shared by 4 students. Meal allowances being meager, most students stocked up on groceries and cooked breakfast and dinner in, with the related chores being shared. That experience itself is worth a chapter, but it will be left to another day. The month-long course consisted mostly of lectures, with great boring blocks being given over to lectures on the law. Most of these were given by a senior NIS supervisor, a very knowledgeable, intelligent, careful man who I truly admire and respect, but his lecture technique was dreadful. His delivery was one long, unvarying, sleep-inducing monotone in voice that ranged from high summer drone to a dragonfly to a steady background rumble and hum of a refrigerator, then oh so slowly back again. Compounding the problem were the late hours I was keeping, sightseeing of course, and the welcome but deadly placement of my seat immediately adjacent to a radiator that was turned up to the maximum to keep out the unusual cold January. I knew I was in deep trouble when my eyelids began to droop at 8:30 a.m., with four or so more hours until lunch. I drooled on the desk and regularly experienced a heart-stopping head snap known to all would-be classroom nappers, and my inner lips still bear the scars of repeated attempts to force my eyelids open by sheer will and use of self-inflicted pain. Also, I remembered was the ever-present dread that during one of my brief or so relaxed doze-off I would convulsively grunt or otherwise draw unwanted attention to myself, revealing thereby my wickedness and lack of serious purpose. But my fears were not realized, and in small part because I mastered the art of cobra bob and weave, even in a state of haze, keeping my drooping head directly behind the one in front, out of the official view. I recalled the overlong and far too detailed photography classes, which, to my unappreciative mind, were concerned more with teaching one how to field strip a camera than how to take a picture. We were all deluged with the manner of technical detail, a detail that would have swamped Ansel Adams, let alone myself, who did not know an f-stop from a bus stop and really did not mind that I didn't. In the 18 months I had been aboard, I had never seen a camera in my home office, and I suppose they had one, but it took the obligatory notes and I was thankful for anything that gave respite from the lectures. We did spend several hours on an indoor pistol range, and all was rather routine except for one incident that stands out as a highlight of sorts. The instructor in the class spent several hours talking about pistols and ammunition, and shooting, positions and perils. Like all pistol range instructors do, while the anxious student patiently wait, eager to get on with it. The instructor was a special agent assigned to NIS HQ and was obviously quite enamored with his teaching technique and his vast knowledge of gun lore and his ability as a marksman. What his regular job was in headquarters, I had no idea, nor did I know anything about him personally, but he struck me as a type commonly referred to as a gun nut, one of those guys that you sometimes see at the pistol range by himself, target shooting, with his personally owned ebony-handled commemorative edition 45 caliber automatic, standing impeccably angled, offhand akimbo, scooping each shot with careful removing his World War II bomber-style pilot jacket, standing impeccably angled, offhand akimbo, scooping each shot after carefully removing his World War II bomber pilot-style yellow-tinted shooting glasses in order to get a better view through his personally owned 50-power target scope. Now, I am not saying our instructor was this type, but his manner led me to accept that he probably was. He was attired in the usual suit and had his gun holstered on his right hip under his coat, such concealment contributing quietly to the aura of a modest but earnest reserve that emanates from the professional shootist. At any rate, after a detailed by-the-numbers explanation, he announced he was going to demonstrate for the group a proper quick-draw technique. Facing up with his hands at his side, he stared toward the horizon, at peace with himself, serenely unaware of all the unimagined reverie shattering the event was about to demand that he sprung into deadly action. At a given internal signal, he flipped the coat back and with his right hand and with one graceful, sweeping motion, unholstered his weapon, thrusting it forward in both hands as he bent his knees, assuming the class shooter's crouch. Flawless, except that he thrust the gun forward, the hammer caught on his right coat tail, spinning him jerkily to the left and damn near off his feet. My natural reaction was to burst forth with a loud, derisive cackle, because what had just taken place was really my kind of funny. However, having been repeatedly warned by my supervising agent that smart alecky activity was to be avoided at all costs, I restrained myself, albeit with no little effort. But the image was delicious, and sustained me in many of the darker moments throughout the rest of the course. I still draw on it as a matter of fact. One semi-large scale practical exercise during the course was a surveillance problem. No automobiles in those days, strictly on foot surveillance with the use of taxis, buses, as appropriate. A classmate like myself had several years in law enforcement experience and was picked as one of the student team leaders, and I was chosen to lead another team. The surveillance problem was laid out so that two teams following two hares, like rabbits, would start out in different points in D.C., go through all the slick and tricky maneuvers usually inflicted upon basic students, cross paths around noon, and with the two hares having lunch together, then back to the streets for a couple more meets, phone books marked, taxis held, etc. My classmates' team and mine were scheduled to have the first go. On the day, my team prepositioned itself amidst the faded opulence of the old Willard Hotel. Most team members were cleverly hidden behind an obligatory newspaper when the appearance of the hare triggered the mass exodus of all lobby loafers, and we hit the D.C. streets, eschewing the use of textbook signals, i.e. blowing of noses, tying of shoelaces, rubbing of head, lighting of cigarette, etc. We stuck undetected to our hair like glue. Nothing of official significance occurred that morning, but a sidebar vignette stands out in my memory. Our hair jumped in a cab at the Greyhound bus depot, and we were forced to hustle upon another taxi. An empty one pulled in. We jumped in and told the cab driver to step on it and follow that cab. The cabbie was friendly enough, but reacted like he had been through this drill before. While he obviously did not share our enthusiasm for fast action, he nevertheless slowly got up to speed, and then in a chuckling mumble, just loud enough for us to hear, said, "Follow that cab," just like George Raff. I laughed out loud. Again, my kind of funny. Another incident, clearly demonstrating ingenuity and the ability to capitalize on the opportunity, occurred at the Hot Shop restaurant, in which several NIS HQ observers and both hairs were having lunch. After satisfying ourselves that they were actually going to eat, my fellow team leader and myself ordered up. While waiting for our Salisbury steak a la carte, my table mate walked to the coat rack, where he proceeded to rifle through the coat pockets of the hairs, the NIS HQ observers, and, in an effort to be thorough, the coats of several innocent patrons as well. The depredation yielded up on all manner of valuable information, such as a complete route map of the remainder of the surveillance, but it hadn't. It mounted to little more than random notes, pencil stubs, gum, handkerchiefs, but I nonetheless considered the feat a daring stroke that easily could have resulted in, along with a rather trilby hat belonging to one of the NIS HQ observers. This hat went into the trash can too, not with malice, you understand, but merely as a gesture underscoring our sense of disappointment. The remainder of the surveillance went smoothly, and in at least one case, barehandedly. The remainder of the surveillance went smoothly, in at least one case, bareheadedly, but without further incitement. During the post-exercise critique, the missing hat was mentioned, but any suspicions expressed were general and vague, and I was all the more impressed with my classmates' audacious. I was more impressed with my classmates' audacious actions and secretly wished that I had played in a larger part. One particular memory related to the basic course needs no effort to recall. It endures in vivid outline. It concerns one of the instructors and the insensitive attitude towards the students in general, and to me in particular. The man was not mean-spirited or evil. He was an intelligent man who later compiled a distinguished career lauded with honors and marked by high achievement. But he had a to-the-manner-born hauteur that was regularly visited upon those he considered his inferiors. A category into which he unfortunately deposited most of his associates. The incident occurred during a pre-surveillance briefing when he was explaining how important it was to dress as natives in the area in order to blend in with the surroundings. At this point, he asked me to stand, and then proceeded to use me as a negative example of how not to dress. His remarks were not made good naturedly or with humor, and they stung. I will admit that Robert Hall got more of my business than did Brooks Brothers at that stage of my career. But this was not wholly a matter of choice. My clothes were neither flashy nor early Columbo. I've never been able to comprehend how it happened. He was able to strike my vitals with that, with what my vitals with what I knew for him was merely an offhand shot. An offhand shot. But it had penetrated deep in my lodged hard. But it had penetrated deep and lodged hard. I was embarrassed and hurt. I have never forgotten that feeling, nor the man who induced it. I have never forgotten that feeling, nor the man who induced it. The school was really whipped past. The school had really whipped past, like an Indy 500, all the frantic activity, the sustained effort, and the high energy output that had been crammed into the brief period came to abrupt end with the turn of a key, which in my case was handed in at the Clarendon front desk. At the Clarendon front desk. A few last goodbyes, a flight home, and it was over. I was in a great frame of mind and all the more enamored with my status as a special agent. I had performed well, attaining the overall top score in the class and the checkered flag that would please my boss at home. And I had not allowed my attitude to be colored by the spot of unpleasantness with an arrogant instructor. In fact, I was taking with me a bit of consolation to counter the lingering effect of the barbs placed by my imperious friend. It had been his shiny new trilby hat that I found. It had been his shiny new trilby hat that had found its way into the hot shop restroom trash can. Yes, God was good. To be continued. And that story is like many others of being hired at the time and going through basic school. Kirstenbrock really knocked a home run with that article, which was published in the summer fall of 1988 in the NIS Bulletin, which does not exist anymore. We have now the Gold Shield, which basically covers only retirement issues. The active service doesn't really have a bulletin anymore, I don't think. Anyway, sad but true. We'll have more of those in the future. I hope you've enjoyed this reading of what it was like to be an ONI/NIS agent beginning in the 60s. It was a different time, and they did things differently. And as he said, but with as much enthusiasm. So, hope you've enjoyed this. It's been about an hour, a little bit more, and we'll have more of these in the future. So I hope you continue listening to NCR Sports and Phil. Remember, if you like the show, like and subscribe, and don't forget, ring the bell and give me a thumbs up so we can keep this show going. And with that, that's all. We'll see you next time. Have a great day, everybody. 3, 2, 1. The surveillance problem was laid out so that two teams following two hares, or rabbits is what we would call them in a surveillance exercise, would start out in different points in D.C., go through all the slick and tricky maneuvers usually inflicted upon the basic students, cross paths around noon, with the two hares having lunch together, then back to the streets for a couple of more meets, phone books marked, taxis held, etc. My classmates' team and mine were scheduled to have the first go. On the day my team 3, 2, 1. On the day my team prepositioned itself amidst the faded potted palm opulence of the old Willard Hotel. Most team members were cleverly hidden behind obligatory newspaper when the appearance of a hare triggered the mass exodus of all the lobby loafers, and we hit the D.C. streets, eschewing the use of textbook signals, i.e. blowing of noses, tying of shoelaces, rubbing of head, lighting of cigarette, etc. We stuck undetected to our hair like glue. Nothing of official significance occurred that morning, but a sidebar vignette stands out in my memory. Our hare jumped in a cab at the Greyhound bus depot. We were forced to hustle up another taxi. An empty one pulled in, we jumped in, and told the cab driver to step on it and follow that cab. The cabbie was friendly enough, but reacted like he had been through this drill before. While he obviously did not share our enthusiasm for fast action, he nevertheless slowly got up to speed and then, in a chuckling mumble, just loud enough for us to hear, said, "Follow that cab," just like George Raff. I laughed out loud. Again, my kind of funny. Another incident clearly demonstrating ingenuity and the ability to capitalize on the opportunity occurred in the Hot Shop restaurant in which several NIS HQ observers and both hares were having lunch. After satisfying ourselves that they were actually going to eat, my fellow team leader and myself ordered up. While waiting for our Salisbury steak a la carte, my table mate walked to the coat rack where he proceeded to rifle the coat pockets of the hares, the NIS HQ observers, and, in an effort to be thorough, the coats of several innocent patrons as well. He brought his haul back to the table, and we eagerly sorted through the booty. I would like to say that this depredation yielded up all manner of valuable information, such as a complete route map of the remainder of their surveillance, but it didn't. It mounted to little more than random notes, pencil stubs, gum, handkerchiefs, etc. But I nonetheless considered the feat a daring stroke that easily could have resulted in our out first great intelligence coup. But my classmates, not one to confuse intentions with results, disgustedly threw the entire pile into the restroom trash can, scooping from the hat rack along the way a rather nice Trilby hat belonging to one of the NIS HQ observers. This hat went into the trash can too, but not with malice, you understand, but merely as a gesture underscoring our sense of disappointment. The remainder of the surveillance went smoothly, and in at least one case, barehandedly, without further excitement. During the post-exercise critique, the missing hat was mentioned, but any suspicions expressed were generally and vague, and I was all the more impressed with my classmates' audacious actions and secretly wished that I had played a larger part. One particular memory related to the basic course needs no effort to recall. It endures in vivid outline. It concerns one of the instructors and his insensitive attitude towards the students in general, and to me in particular. The man was not mean-spirited nor evil. He was an intelligent man who later compiled a distinguished career, lauded with honors and marked high achievement. 3, 2, 1, and marked by high achievement. But he had the to manner-born hauteur that was regularly visited upon those who considered his inferiors, and category into which he unfortunately deposited most of his associates. The incident occurred during a pre-surveillance briefing when he was explaining how important it was to dress as the natives in the area in order to blend into the surroundings. His remarks were not made good-naturedly or with humor, and they stung. I'll admit that Robert Hall got more of my business than did Brooks Brothers at that stage of my career. But this was not wholly a matter of choice. My clothes were neither flashy nor early Columbo. I have never been able to comprehend how it happened that he was able to strike my vitals with what I knew for him was merely an offhand shot, but it had penetrated deep and lodged hard. I was embarrassed and hurt. I have never forgotten that feeling, nor the man who induced it. The school had really whipped past. Like an Indy 500, all the frantic activity, the sustained effort, and the high energy output that had been crammed into the brief period came to an abrupt end with a turn of a key, which in my case was handed in at the Clarendon front desk. A few last goodbyes, the flight home, and it was over. I was in a great frame of mind, and all the more enamored with my status as a special agent. I had performed well, attaining the overall top score in the class and the checkered flag that would please my boss at home. And I had not allowed my attitude to be colored by the spot of unpleasantness with the arrogant instructor. In fact, I was taking with me a bit of consolation to the counter the lingering effect of the barbs placed by my imperious friend. It had been his shiny new Trilby hat that had found its way into the hot shop restroom trash can. Yes, God was good. To be continued. So, as I tell the agents today, you're not much different from the agents of the Office of Naval Intelligence when they came in. Although they had more challenges than you did, meaning equipment and vehicles, things like that, you, as an NCIS special agent, have the same passions that they had to solve the crime and catch the bad guys. So, I hope you enjoyed this reading of ONI in the early 60s Was Not What Kirstenbrock Expected, a lighthearted look back. Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you next time on NCIS Reports from the Field. The Times